This evening, I'm going to read the second half of chapter 3 of Alchemy by Marie-Louise von Franz. And this is part of our lesson for the adult reading group, the advanced reading group on Wednesday at 1 o'clock. So reading on, I'm on page 76, and I'm reading from this book, Alchemy, by Marie-Louise von Franz. After the illusion of the statement that a lion generates a lion and a dog, the text continues. Having been fortunate in participating in the divine power, we can now proceed with the preparation of other things. Therefore, take quicksilver, and so on. Then the text goes on with the recipes, which I cannot interpret because I simply do not know what they mean. Some, like the urine of an uncorrupted boy, can be amplified, for we know that this played a role in antique magic. What other substances referred to, we don't know, and the historians of chemistry conjecture and quarrel as to their probable meaning, most of which have not been definitely established. We only know that they are mixtures of metals, etc., principally used in the manufacture of alloys, and that there were certain procedures of melting or of slow corrosion by acids. While still giving such recipes, Isis says, quote, "Now, my child, you know the mystery, which is the elixir of the widow," unquote. That sentence shows that some of the recipes refer to healing elixirs, to some powerful medicines in the African sense of the word, rather than to the production of some kind of metal. How does that link up if you think of it naively? How does that link up if you think of it naively? Good evening, Phil. Thank you for being here. I had an experience in my childhood which might elucidate this. When I was about 10 years old, I frequently had to stay away from school because of illness and went to school only in the mornings. In the afternoons, when my sister was at school, I was alone and very bored and had nobody to play with. So at the back of the hen house, I established what I called my laboratory. I had once read that amber was formed by resin falling into seawater and solidifying after many years. So I thought I would make some amber. Promptly, in my fantasy, amber became a yellow pearl, and I thought I would make a round yellow pearl of amber. By means of endlessly climbing and falling from fir trees, I collected a quantity of resin, but then thought that I had to produce seawater. From the dictionary, I discovered what seawater consisted of, and I stole salt and iodine from the bathroom and mixed, as completely as one would at that age, something I called seawater. Then, thinking that the amber had to be purified before the yellow pearl would be produced, I started to melt and cook it so as to get rid of the dead ants and such things in it. And while doing this and watching the amber being heated up and melted in my loneliness, I started to feel pity for it, thinking that it was being burnt and that I must propitiate it. So I started talking to the resin, saying that it should not be unhappy if I burnt it, for in the end, it was to become a wonderful yellow pearl, and it must just bear being tortured with the fire now. In this way, I got into a whole fantasy about producing this yellow pearl, the idea of which had originated quite rationally from something I had read. But in the loneliness of the task, the thing became amplified into a complete alchemical opus with prayers for its success. I prayed to the amber, begging it not to be angry with me for cooking it, and promised to make it into a pearl, and so on. That is primitive and infantile mentality, and we must suppose that these people had a similar attitude. It must be remembered that at that time, it was very dangerous to make chemical experiments because then you were looked on as a witch doctor with all the consequences that entailed. You were respected, but also hated and feared, and therefore such things had to be done secretly and in loneliness, which always brings up the unconscious. You could describe this childhood occupation, which lasted for over a year, as play or something like active imagination, performed with chemical substances, which to a great extent is what alchemy is. Active imagination can be done with colors. Nowadays, we do it chiefly by painting or by writing stories, but it can also be done another way, by collecting substances and mixing them. That is what these people did, and thus went a little bit off the track of producing only a chemical experiment into producing one in which fantasy material was predominant. Just as I rationally began in wanting to make amber, and in the process fell into the fantasy of producing a yellow pearl. Synchronistic events do happen in these as much as in other fields of experiment. They are experienced as miracles and naturally confirm such fantasies. That this still constitutes a modern chemical, that this still continues in modern medical laboratories is evidenced by the story I heard of a scientist who tried to produce a certain vitamin in a chemical form. He had everything figured out and knew that the product should be produced, but it did not seem to want to crystallize. When something crystallizes depends on very irrational factors. Of course, the weight and heat and form of the mixture all play a part, but there are still nowadays factors which cannot be overlooked in chemical manufacture, but one does not know upon what they depend. So the wretched thing, contrary to all expectation, did not crystallize. He watched it day and night, saying it ought to crystallize, but it just remained liquid. The scientist became sick of watching it and got a helper to carry on and keep the heat at a certain temperature, and himself went home and fell asleep and had the most amazing alchemical dream in which a voice said, "Now go and you will see that it has crystallized." He got up and telephoned, and it was true. It had crystallized. So the unconscious of this man was actually connected to or informed about the chemical process going on in the retort. You can label that as synchronicity, but in doing so, you have not explained anything. It is simply a fact. And it shows that we do not know how the unconscious is connected with matter, but only that it is, and that it has a knowledge of such things. How do we know? For our scientific knowledge in this respect has come to an end for the time being. Apparently, chemistry, even in the most modern times, still has a connection with the unconscious of the person performing the experiment, even to the extent of such things happening as I have described. There again, we touch on a secret, and that kind of experience, but on a more primitive and crude basis, was generally at the back of the alchemist's experiments. If we sum up the text we have just discussed, not from a psychological, but from a historical standpoint, we see that in alchemy, there are religious ideas and conceptions which lead back to Hellenized Egypt with its early admixture of Greek and late Egyptian religions. I cannot read you all the texts, but in others, there are traces of Jewish and Gnostic symbolism and many other religions of that time. The other element, connected in thought but disconnected as far as the texts are concerned, is that of the recipes, obviously remnants of secret craft traditions, which originated with African medicine men and were concerned with the making of love charms, medicines to ensure beauty, and with the making of alloys and so on. All such recipes were the secrets of the smith craftsman and the medicine man. During the Egyptian civilization, they were probably handed down by certain classes of priests who had monopolies on the manufacture of their particular alloys or medicines, which they obtained through the ruling pharaoh and probably kept in secret books stored in the temples. Thank you for being here, Justin. It's quite early for you. Yeah, I agree with you, Phil. The origin of the unconscious lies outside the. In the same way, there is now the museum in Cairo, a papyrus which has been dug up and which contains all the recipes for the embalming of corpses. The instructions for this very complicated procedure are given in a purely technical and chemical way that was the secret of a class of Annapolis priests and constituted knowledge imparted only to initiated priests. That probably goes back to the oldest kind of primitive African medicine men's tradition and can still nowadays be unearthed in Africa in a more simple form. The psychological attitude and secret at the back of such procedures being still unchanged. By the way, Justin, if you need a letter to help you with your quest for next summer, please let me know and I can help you with that perhaps. My next Greek text introduces a third element into these early chemical writings, namely Greek natural philosophy. Perhaps one of the greatest historical events of late antiquity was that in Greek natural philosophy, the pre-Socratic philosophy, men like Democritus, Heraclitus, and Thales of Miletus, and Anaximenes and Anaximander speculated on established theories about nature and were the creators of such technical terms as time, space, atom, matter, and energy. All the basic concepts of modern physics go back, as you know, to Greek philosophy. For the Greeks were the creators of these concepts in the specific natural scientific meaning, though they did not experiment with matter to a great extent. They had few or no laboratories, and most of their theories about nature came from speculative intuition, though they sometimes used practical examples to explain what they meant. For instance, in Democritus, if Democritus says that the atom has different forms, let us say like a little pyramid with corners like hooks by which they are connected, that would be the kind of materialistic model of his idea of the atom. Round atoms would be the soul, and there are also fire atoms which roll through the spaces of the atom. That is Democritus's model of reality. Such things the Greeks never thought of proving or demonstrating by experiment, as is common scientific procedure nowadays. If you have such a speculative model, you try to prove it by practical experiment, showing that it does or does not fit the facts. This the Greeks did not do. But then Greek thought, naturally and unfortunately in a very watered down phase, met the Egyptian secret sciences, which consisted entirely of an age-old practical craft tradition about the behavior of matter. The Egyptians knew a great deal from the practical angle. They knew how to make enamel and invisible ink and all sorts of complicated alloys. And when these two worlds met in Ptolemaic Egypt, that was enormously fertile for both, because what in Egyptian tradition consisted of recipes and religious thought now met with the accurate scientific thought of the Greeks. Okay, noted, Justin. We could call the moment of the birth of alchemy when the thought models of Greek philosophy met with the experimental practices of Egyptian traditions. We give you a little more insight on this point. I would like to read a brief outline of a very long text by a later alchemist, Olympiodorus, whose name you have certainly come across in Jung's writings. Olympiodorus was a minister and official of the Byzantine court of the 5th century AD. He went as a member of a delegation to Attila, king of the Huns, and wrote a rather famous history of his time. He published in 425. Some of his biographers say that at the same time he was known as a great magician and medicine man at the Byzantine court, and according to the text, was much occupied with alchemical experiments. However, in the histories of alchemy, this is said to be not true, for he did not possess much practical knowledge, and even if he did perform such experiments, it is certain that he was more interested in the theoretical or symbolic aspects of alchemy. He claimed that the aims of alchemy could not be achieved in a rational way, that you could follow the recipes as much as you liked, but would never get anywhere without the help of magic and magical powers. So he began to have a double attitude about So he began to have a double attitude about what could be called serious or practical sciences and magic, a split with which we have not met in the earlier texts. The reason for this is that Olympiodorus had a Greek philosophical education, which he tried to apply to his knowledge. I would like to give you the text as it did, sorry, my voice seems to be struggling. I would like to give you the text as I did that of Isis, namely in its strange literal confusion, so that you may get your own personal impressions. I will take a section from chapter 30 on the sacred or divine art, and then go on from chapter 41, which gives, as it were, the essence of his writings. In chapter 30, Olympiodorus speaks of lead and quotes the prophetess Maria, who who is reported to have said that the black lead must be considered as the basis of the work. He then comments on this. The theme is continued in chapter 41, which says, quote, now see how black lead is prepared. As I said before, common lead is black from the very beginning, but our lead becomes black, which at the beginning it was not. Experiments which teach you, and by them you discover the real demonstration and proof, opinions worthy of credence are unanimous on this matter. I will now try to approach our goal. If the awesome and ally like silver, which though exactly what it is not known, does not become gold or could not become gold, though it is a work, one should not despise that the old people said, namely that the letter kills, but the spirit brings to life. For the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. 2 Corinthians 3-6. The Analyst and the Rabbi. And you see C.G. Jung there with Rabbi Leo Beck. And I will be playing Dr. Jung. This will be next summer at Helena, Montana, in her Confluence. Yeah, I haven't gotten a role as Karl Marx yet. I don't think I'm going to be playing him. All right, reading the next paragraph, and I hope this works. Now, this is in complete harmony with everything said by the old philosophers and points to the same end, to the saying of the Lord. Brackets, Olympiodorus was a Christian and quoted the Bible, pointing out that one must not take alchemical texts and the recipes literally, for that killed, but one must understand the spirit of the text and what that meant. The oracles of Apollo are also in harmony with what we mean, for they mention the tomb of Osiris. Bracket, this amplifies our other text, close bracket. But what is the tomb of Osiris? There is a corpse swathed in linen mummy bands with only the naked face visible. And the interpreting Osiris, the oracle says, quote, Osiris, the oracle says, quote, Osiris is the suffocated coffin in which are hidden his limbs and whose face only is visible to mortal beings. Hiding the body's nature is astonished. He, Osiris, is the original principle of all moist substances. He is kept down as a prisoner by the sphere of the fire. He therefore has suffocated all the lead. Another oracle by the same author says, take some gold, which is called the male of the chrysocolla, bracket, whatever that substance is, close bracket, and a man who has been kneaded together. The gold of the Ethiopian earth produces it from its drops. A certain species of ant brings the gold to the surface of the earth and enjoys it. Put him together with his wife, a vapor, still the divine bitter water comes out. When it was thickened or colored red, bracket, red copper, close bracket, with the juice of the golden vine of Egypt, then smear over it the leaflets of the light-bringing goddess, bracket, that must be the moon, close bracket, and also of the red copper, bracket, Cyprus, can stand for either copper or Venus, close bracket, or the red Venus, bracket, probably Venus is meant, close bracket, and then thicken it until it coagulates into gold. Now the philosopher Ptasios, who speaks about the beginning of the alchemical world, is in complete harmony with this. And he also means our lead when he says that the sphere of the fire holds down and suffocates through the lead. Then interpreting his own sayings, he says, quote, all that comes from the male or the arsenic water, unquote. The word arsenic means male. It is not the arsenic we know, but refers to all substances which have a dynamic drive in them, which affects other substances. Everything which seems to affect another substance was male because it was active, so it is not to be confused with what we call arsenic. Arsenic is what he is referring to when he speaks of the sphere of the fire. Quote, this is a long quote. The lead is so possessed by devils and so shameless that those who want to learn about it fall into madness on account of their unconsciousness. You will have met that saying in Jung's books, for he often quotes it. Now I will explain about the chemical elements, and then this will become clear. They call lead the egg. I mean the egg of the four elements. That is what Zosimus says. And by that, he really always means lead. If they explain its shape, they really in secret allude to the whole thing, because as Maria says, the four elements are one. When you hear the word sands, you must understand that that means shapes or ideas, quote, close bracket. In Greek, it can mean either one or the other. Close bracket. If you hear ide or ide, shapes, forms, ideas, that really means the sands, the types of sand, because the four bodies or the four elements are also the four bodiness, bracket. That is an invented word, but it is also in the Greek, close bracket. Zosimus explains the four bodiness in the following way. Now the poor, quote in Greek, bracket in Greek, the adjective is feminine, close bracket. Thing falls into the four body in which it is chained, and at once changes from one color to another. All the colors into which the technique wishes to bind it, white, yellow, and even black, or the first black, then white, and then yellow. And when this feminine thing has evidenced all these colors and has rejuvenated, it continues into old age and then dies in the four body, which means iron, tin, bronze, and lead, with each of which she dies in the rubido. the state of becoming red, and so is completely destroyed in that she cannot run away, which fact is very satisfactory to the alchemist, for now she cannot escape. And then one repeats the whole thing, by which her persecutor is also chained, bracket, the one repeats the whole thing, by which her persecutor is also chained, close bracket, all of which takes place outside the round vessel. What is the round vessel? Either the fire of the round form of the vessel prevents her from running away, just as though in an illness, the blood that had been destroyed and was now renewed. So in her silver state, she is seen to have red blood, and that is the gold, closed in quote. Now I need to show you one. Okay, so figure 21, the double face of alchemy, laboratory and library, corresponds to the twofold nature of the individuation process. The act of participation in outer relate. The act of participation in outer reality and relationships, together with the process of inner reflection. This is a long literal passage of real alchemy, from which you can see how charitable Dr. Jung has been in selecting passages and publishing them together in chapters, because if you read the original text, you too might go into the madness of the lead. Do you think? Okay, not much more. 6 more pages, which includes 5 more images. You read Dr. Jung's books, you think it is impossible to understand the thing. It is so complicated, but actually he has enormously simplified it and has made a tremendous effort to get the pearls out of the dunghill and bring some form into it. For the original material is like the above. If you have once accustomed yourself to follow this line of thought, you will find that the whole thing is completely logical. It has the same logic as dream and can be taken as such. The first time you hear a dream, you could think it completely crazy. But if you read this material as you would a dream, you will get to the meaning. For example, Olympiodorus speaks of the black lead, and it is clear that this is the original substance and is therefore the mystery of which we have already spoken, the prima materia, the basic substance of the world in which lies God's secret of life and death. He speaks of it as our lead, which in the beginning is not black, and contrasts it with the common lead, by which he means that what ordinary craftsmen call lead, such as is used in the manufacture of pipes. For at the time of the Roman Empire, lead was used to make water pipes. It is, see where that parenthetical begins, called lead is not what they, the alchemists, are referring to when they speak of lead. It is a different kind of lead, a more basic substance with which you must experiment, he says, to discover what earlier writers meant. He then quotes the Bible, saying that the text must not be taken literally, which is also understandable, and says that the transformation of the lead is a secret. Then he quotes the oracle of Apollo, which must be in an older writing, which has been lost, and says that this is Osiris's coffin. At this point, I'll show you Osiris's coffin, because that will be helpful in understanding what we're talking about here. Okay, so figure 22, Osiris in the cedar coffin covered with lead, representing the eclipse of consciousness into depression. Reading on, to understand this, you must know the legend, according to which Seth killed Osiris by first making a leaden coffin and then getting people, when drunk at a party, to enter it under the pretext of finding out whom it would fit. But when Osiris got into the coffin, Seth promptly put the lid on, covered it with lead, and threw it into the sea. Therefore, it could be said that Osiris was suffocated in the lead. So you can think of the tomb of Osiris as a lead coffin, or a coffin sealed up, sealed up with lead, within which lies the dead god, or the divine spirit, in the form assumed in death. That is the meaning he is trying to convey. Osiris lies as a mummy in the coffin with only the face visible. You have seen mummies swathed in linen bands with the mask showing the face. The meaning of this is not clear, but one could say that there was something human and something inhuman in it. For if you were to interpret it symbolically as a dream, you would say that it must refer to a semi-human being. If the face is human, then part can be understood from the human aspect, but part one cannot understand. Olympiodorus continues by saying that Osiris himself is the suffocated coffin or tomb, which conceals his limbs and shows only the face to human beings. Brotois is a specific name for human beings and means the mortals. Osiris is immortal, or the immortal one. To mortals, he only shows his human face, while the rest of his body is a secret, hiding the body's nature marveled or was astonished, unquote. Just mention here that when my mother had died and I had to identify her before they cremated her body, they only exposed just her face. And so I had to identify her only from her face. I cannot entirely understand this, except that it must mean it is partly understandable because there is a human face, and partly a mystery about which even nature marvels. I cannot give any further explanation. That is the beginning of all moist substances. And obviously my mother is the moist substance that gave birth to me. Basic matter, original matter, the starting point, the arche, the moist substance stands for the basic material of the cosmos being caught in the sphere of the fire. From what takes place later, it can be seen that there was the following connection. Matter was put into a bottle, which was securely sealed and then cooked. And this was considered to be an exact parallel to the divine spirit, Osiris, the God-man. lying dead in his lead coffin, for the matter of the bottle was in exactly the same state. There's another image here. Let me see that. Okay, here it is. Figure 23, the alchemical sealed vessel, here containing Mercurius as symbol of the spirit imprisoned in matter, is comparable psychologically to a base attitude of introversion, which acts as a container for the transformation of attitudes and emotions. That was precisely what I felt when I tortured my resin in my early childhood, for I felt it to be tortured by fire in its bottle, so to speak. It could not run away, which means it could not evaporate, for I also had closed my bottle. Therefore, it is caught and I have it in hand and I'm doing something with it. The analogy is Seth catching Osiris, and now because he has been caught by Seth, by the powerful principle of evil, he is transformed and resurrected. That was probably their association. So he was suffocated all the lead. He has suffocated all the lead. I do not understand this, but it seems to me that this imprisonment in the coffin or in an alchemical vessel would represent a process of suffocation, the death of the prima materia by suffocation. Obviously, there is here an analogy to what we do when we stop a human being from naively projecting and force that person to look only at himself or herself. That would be like suffocation, for one wants to go to the analyst and say, that is how my mother brought me up. To which the analyst replies that one should see the part played by one's own complex, and then one has to accept everything for which one has previously blamed God and fate, parents and husband. That all has to be taken back, and it is like suffocation, a kind of death, for the drive to project everything onto the outside is stopped. The vessel is a symbol for the attitude which prevents anything escaping outside. It is a basic attitude of introversion, which on principle does not let anything escape into the outside world. The illusion that the whole trouble lies outside oneself has to come to an end and things have to be looked at from within. That is how we now suffocate the mysterium of the unconscious. We do not know what the unconscious is, but we suffocate it through this concentrated treatment by which all projection is stopped by intensifying the psychological process. It is also the torture of fire, because when the flow of intensity of the psychological process becomes concentrated, one is roasted in what one is. Therefore, the person in the tomb and the tomb itself are the same thing, for you roast in what you are yourself and not in anything else. And one could say that one is cooked in one's own juice and is therefore the tomb, the container of the tomb, the suffocated one, and the suffocator, the coffin, and the dead God in it. Okay, let's come back and see you for a bit. Okay, so the coffin and the dead God in it. The one within is naturally not the ego, but your whole being, for you are looking at your whole being and not your ego, which would run away. Now, this is so painful that we all try to escape. I think I have not analyzed for years and years anyone who has not from time to time flirted with the idea of dropping it all and returning to so-called normal life. Therefore, I think it is very understandable that the text, after a time, speaks of the woman who always tries to escape and who has to be bound into the fourfold body or the forebody. Returning to the text, Olympiodorus says to take some substance, i.e., the golden stone, which is called the male part of the chrysocolla. Probably he had some specific material in mind, and a molded man. Now, who is the molded man, or the man who has been kneaded into shape? Olympiodorus is a Christian, and that is a definition of Adam. It simply means that to take two chemical substances, which we do not know, and make Adam, the connection for a man of that time would be that Adam was made from clay, and therefore, according to the Bible, clay is the prima materia of man, the basic secret of man. They were no longer referring to clay. They knew then that it could not mean clay. Their knowledge of biology and physiology was sufficient to know that the man made of clay was simply a simile. Therefore, the clay stood for the prima. The man formed out of clay is therefore Adam, who at that time was a symbol of the self, or one could say the man who has just come from the hands of God, the unspoilt man, the man who has not yet passed through the process of corruption. Uncorrupted man, straight from the hands of God, that is the man who has been kneaded, and that is why he does not speak of Adam, for Adam is associated with sin and corruption and Eve, etc. In alluding to Adam in this way, he means Adam in his original unspoilt form when just created by God. Obviously, this refers to the prima materia, which we call the self, which is why in Zen Buddhism, it is said, quote, "Show me thy original face," unquote. In one of the koans, one of the masters gets enlightened when another master says that to him. The gold of the Ethiopian earth generates it, i.e., the man, out of drops, and there some species of ant brings it up to the surface of the earth and enjoys it. That refers to the famous Arimasps, who also are mentioned in Goethe's Faust, in English, Arimaspians. There was a legend in late antiquity that in India there existed at one time enormous ants as big as human beings, which dug up gold. For the Greeks, India was the land of wisdom and riches. It was the paradise where gold was to be found on the trees and in the streets and everywhere else, and where wise men walked about. In descriptions of India at that time, there was mention of these arimasps, huge legendary ants who brought gold up out of the earth, and that was supposed to be the secret of India's great wealth. Therefore, when Olympiodorus says this, he is referring to the ants. If you go into the symbolism of the ant at that time, you find that according to certain versions, ants resurrected the sun by pushing it every morning over the horizon so that they were a complete parallel to the Egyptian scarab, which every morning pushes the disk of the sun over the horizon and makes it rise. The scarab is a symbol of the rising sun and of the resurrection. This legend of the scarab was in late antiquity replaced in certain traditions by huge ants which have exactly the same function. Therefore, the reference here is again to the resurrection of the sun, or that moment of the very first creation of God, which according to our interpretation would be the symbol of consciousness. In psychological language, one would say, go back to the original human being within you, go back to that place where the nervous sympathetic reactions or your unconscious link up with the origin of your consciousness. Put more accurately, it means, quote, go back to the original point of your consciousness. Try to return to the place from which your consciousness comes, to the threshold of the unconscious, unquote. Then put this atom together with his wife, the vapor, till the latter bitter divine water issues. Almost done here. This means that this atom, the original thing, is united with its opposite, which seems to be a vapor-like substance, and the two together then give birth to the bitter, watery substance. That is the motif of the conjunctio, the bringing together of the opposites, and the result is the mystical divine water, the bitter water. Psychologically, that would mean, put yourself in an attitude of reflection in which you ask yourself where your conscious processes come from. Link that with the fantasy of material and the vapor which comes up from the unconscious. And that means a living insight, which is bitter. The insight we obtain by looking at ourselves is generally very bitter, which is why so few people do it. It is picros, bitter, for it corrodes and is very disagreeable to the illusions of consciousness. That is why we speak of bitter knowledge and bitter realization and bitter truth, for self-knowledge is a bitter experience at the beginning. Thus, if you read the text psychologically, if you take it like a dream, it is not rubbish, but completely logical. One of the great merits of Jung is that he gave us a key to these texts, which are looked upon officially by historians of chemistry as absolute nonsense. For to them, they mean nothing at all. But to us, it is clear why Olympiodorus is what Olympiodorus is driving at, namely an inner experience, an introverted religious experience, which those people had in their meditations and experiments with material phenomena. That was the basis of alchemy. Now there's one question and answer. And there's one more image too. Question: does the reference to Adam refer to him before or after the fall? Dr. von Franz, I think before the fall, because otherwise the text would say Adam and not use this particular expression of the molded and needed man. The needed man refers rather to one aspect of Adam, namely his creation. The fact that he is made out of clay is what should be on one's mind when thinking of him, and not the fact that he was with Eve and the snake, etc. I think that can be corroborated by the fact that Olympiodorus knew Zosimos, who had a Gnostic theory about Adam being the unspoiled original man before the fall. One can therefore be pretty sure that the reference is to Adam before the fall. So the sphere of the fire keeps the lead and suffocates it, says Olympiodorus, and that is the male thing. And the lead is so demonically possessed, so shameless that those who wish to investigate it fall into madness through their unconsciousness, through their lack of knowledge of gnosis. Chemically, that probably alludes to the fact that lead is usually poisonous. That would be its chemical aspect, and naturally it coincides with the fact that at the beginning of an analysis, for instance, when one looks at the unconscious, such strong instinctual drives and emotions generally come up, and one goes through stages which could lead to madness. Alchemists frequently assert that many of them have gone off their heads, which may be taken literally. Many years ago, I had an interesting experience showing that here in Switzerland, there are still mad alchemists. When I was working on these texts in the Central Library, one of the officials asked me whether I was studying alchemical texts. And when I said I was, he told me that I had a colleague to whom he would introduce me. He thought that would be a great joke, and he went over to a little table, a shriveled up old man sitting in the Central Library, poring over an alchemical text, and introduced me, saying I was a specialist in alchemy. I looked at this man, whose name I have forgotten, and when I saw his eyes, I saw at once that he was completely schizophrenic. I sat down beside him, and after a while he said, quote, "Have you got the secret?" I said, "No, not yet." And then he said, quote, "I am very near it. I think I shall have it in another 2 or 3 months," unquote. I said that was marvelous, and then he asked me if I knew Greek, because his trouble was that he didn't know Greek, and that if I could help him with the Greek, he could get it, I said, yes, but not now. That was a real alchemist who had fallen into the mania of the lead. Okay, so there is one other image in this chapter. I'll just share it with you. It is the Ouroboros. And the Ouroboros represents the beginning and the end, the head and the tail. And so it represents the opposites in all situations. And so the head eats from the tail. And so for me, my wife gave me this Ouroboros bracelet. Some of you may know it. I see the Ouroboros as chaos, and chaos surrounds us, but we live within that chaos. And so that's the way I see it. So I hold the chaos outside of me by my knowledge. And I hope that's helpful. Obviously, my voice has totally died on me. And Justin says, lead is also heavy. I agree. Clay can be reshaped. Yes. Phil says, one of the most eloquent ways I've heard it described, and gives me the reassurance, as I've definitely felt this way as an introvert, like I'm being boiled alive, for instance. Well, Phil, I certainly concur with you on that. I have been an introvert all my life, and very frequently my family, before I left home, was moving between different duty stations of my father. And, my brother, sister, and I would sit quietly in the back seat of the car. And we were definitely experiencing the fire that happens within the unconscious. Justin says, in all human sciences, there is a multitude of premises, factors, and mechanisms at work, unlike the theories of natural science, which can be reduced to very little. Okay. Gem collection, it's annoying when ignoramuses don't give Jung credit in some misrepresenting him, and some, yeah. Okay. So thank you, Bronte, for your encouragement on my play attempt. I will be performing the play on June the 12th, 2022 at the Myrna Loy Theater in Helena, Montana. And this will be at our Confluence. It's an invitation-only event. Not the play. The play is going to be open to the public, but the Confluence is an invitation-only event. So if you think you might like to be invited, you might want to consider joining our advanced reading group so that we can get to know you. Because I think it's going to be very heavily attended by our regulars. And I hope some of you regulars who listen to me late at night on a crazy fall, nearly fall evening. So in as much as my voice has died, I am going to excuse myself for tonight. And let's see, the next time I will be dealing with Greek Arabic alchemy. And just to give you a little tantalization, let me bring to your attention the first sort of like the frontispiece image of that. Which is here. And so we'll be, this is the Arabs who you think of as very conservative, but they weren't very conservative back in antiquity. And so we'll be talking about this image and much more in chapter 4 as soon as I can recover my voice. So peace. Take care. Yeah.